Imagine walking into a town square and seeing a man strapped to a wooden pillar, surrounded by a screaming, furious mob. A town official steps up, forces a funnel into the man's mouth, and begins pouring sour, rotten wine down his throat until he literally vomits. Then the crowd dumps the remaining sludge directly over his head, leaving him to sit in his own filth. This wasn't a scene from a dark fantasy dungeon. It was just a standard Tuesday at the local market, and that man was a merchant caught selling watered-down wine. Hollywood loves to paint the medieval market as a quaint, peaceful village square where peasants cheerfully bartered for organic carrots while lute music played softly. But the reality was infinitely more chaotic, high stakes and intensely regulated. It was a hyper-competitive sensory assault where fortunes were made, fraudsters were publicly humiliated, and global trade networks collided with local survival. Today, we're stepping past the romantic myths to uncover what it was actually like to navigate a medieval market, from the bizarre legal courts that settled disputes in hours, to the terrifying lengths people went to just to avoid being poisoned by their groceries. To understand the sheer madness of the market, you first have to understand that you couldn't just show up and start selling things whenever you wanted. In fact, doing so could land you in a freezing jail cell. Every market was anchored by a massive bronze bell, and that bell held absolute power. Until it rang in the morning, no business could legally take place. If you tried to sell a basket of eggs on the road leading into town before the bell rang, you were committing a serious crime called forestalling. The local authorities viewed this as a direct threat because it bypassed the town's official tax collectors. But the rules weren't just about timing, they were about controlling human greed. Another massive crime was regrating, which was the medieval version of scalping. If you bought up grain early in the morning just to resell it at a higher price later that afternoon, when people got desperate, you were labelled a parasite and heavily fined. If you actually managed to get inside once the bell finally rang, a wall of overwhelming sound and smell would hit you. Imagine thousands of people packed into narrow, unpaved streets, screaming at the top of their lungs. Merchants didn't use quiet signs. They hired professional criers to drown out the competition. Livestock was everywhere, with pigs, sheep, and cattle driven right through the crowds, defecating on the ground and trampling anything in their path. That wasn't even the worst part. Because there was no refrigeration, butchers had to slaughter animals right there on the spot to prove the meat was fresh. This meant the centre of the market often featured a literal river of blood and entrails flowing down the muddy cobblestones, mixing with the summer heat to create a stench so foul it could be smelled miles away. It was a paradise for stray dogs, rats, and clouds of black flies, yet people stood right in the middle of it, casually debating the price of cheese. With that much chaos, you might think it was easy for a shady merchant to rip people off. But the medieval justice system anticipated this, creating a level of consumer protection that would make modern regulators blush. Take bread, the absolute baseline of survival. To prevent bakers from skimping on the weight or mixing their flour with cheap sawdust and dirt, the government created the assize of bread. This strict legal framework dictated exactly how much a loaf must weigh based on the current price of wheat. If an inspector found a baker's loaf was even a fraction of an ounce too light, the punishment was swift. They would tie the cheating baker to a wooden frame, attach it to a horse, and drag them flat on their back through the filthiest streets of the town, while the townsfolk pelted them with rotten vegetables. Yet, despite these terrifying deterrents, merchants still tried to pull off some of the most creative scams in human history. Sellers would regularly take old greying meat and rub it with fresh animal fat to make it look shiny and freshly slaughtered. Candle makers would put heavy stones inside blocks of wax to cheat the scales. But the ultimate scam artist was the seller of holy relics. You could walk up to a stall and find a smooth-talking salesman offering you a splinter from the actual cross of Christ, or a feather from an angel's wing, which was usually just a goose feather dipped in glitter. What happened if you realized you'd been completely cheated? You marched directly to the court of pie powder. The name comes from the French phrase pieds poudrés, which translates to dusty feet. This was a temporary court set up right in the market, designed for travelling merchants and shoppers. It was required to hear a case, call witnesses, and hand down a binding verdict within hours, forcing immediate refunds and public punishment before the dust on your shoes even had time to dry. But the market wasn't just a localised hub for peasants buying basic vegetables. If you visited a major international trade fair, the sheer variety of goods would completely shatter your perception of the Dark Ages. The market was a vibrant, global crossroads. A peasant standing in a muddy English town square could actually purchase silk transported along the Silk Road from China, furs from the frozen wilderness of Russia, ivory from Africa, and exotic spices like cinnamon from India. Navigating this global commerce, however, created a massive logistical nightmare: currency. There was no single money system. A merchant from Venice might show up with silver coins, while a trader from Flanders had completely different gold pieces. To solve this, the market featured money changers who meticulously weighed every coin on sensitive scales, checking for coin clipping, where people secretly shaved off the edges of precious metals. Interestingly, this exact banking setup is where we get our modern financial words. The Italian word for the money changer's bench was banco, which evolved into bank. If a changer couldn't pay his debts, the authorities smashed his bench into pieces, a banco rotto, which is the direct origin of the word bankruptcy. If you didn't have any coins at all, the medieval market ran heavily on a brilliant, low-tech credit system known as the tally stick. This was a simple piece of wood with notches cut into it to represent a specific debt. The stick was then split down the middle lengthwise. The merchant kept one half, and the buyer kept the other. Because the natural grain of the wood matched perfectly, it was completely impossible to forge. When harvest time came, they would match the pieces up and settle up the debt. As the sun began to set, the market transformed into a massive community social hour and a dangerous playground for criminals. The streets filled with fire eaters, acrobats, and trained bears. But while everyone was distracted, the real professionals went to work. The market was a gold mine for cut purses, medieval pickpockets who carried sharp little knives designed to slice the leather strings attaching purses to people's belts, leaving victims broke or bleeding in a dark alley. Ultimately, the medieval market was far more than just a place to buy your weekly groceries. It was a high-stakes, terrifyingly efficient machine fueled by human ambition, survival, and the constant battle between absolute chaos and rigid control. It was the literal birthplace of modern capitalism, born out of mud, blood, and the ringing of a bronze bell.